Well, hello, amazing parents, and welcome to another episode of Graceful Parenting, the program where we talk about what the Bible really says about parenting. And I guarantee what you hear on this program, you're not hearing anywhere else. I'm Amy Hayes, your host and guide, and the author of Graceful Parenting. And this is the book that resulted from me going to the scriptures to study, to see what the Bible really said about parenting. The Lord had called me to address parenting in the church, and I said, Lord, you're going to have to show me in the scriptures what it says, because I saw how Christians were parenting their children, and I knew that it wasn't the Father's heart. I knew there was another way that reflected the Father's heart of love, forgiveness, patience, long-suffering, kindness, and we're not seeing that in traditional Christian parenting. And when I say traditional Christian parenting, I'm talking about that model where the parent gives a command, the child's expected to obey, and if he doesn't, he's punished. And then we just wash, rinse, repeat over and over, hoping that eventually the child learns to do what we say. But we know statistically, and if you're a parent with small children, you know in a practical way that this method is flawed. You're on a constant hamster wheel of behavior management, and nothing ever seems to get better. The method is not producing obedience. And so we have to, and statistically, we've known for several decades now through studies that 2 out of 3 children raised under this type of parenting are walking away from the church as young adults. But we keep continuing using it because we don't know any other way, and we were convinced that it was biblical. But today I'm going to show you without a shadow of a doubt that not only is this approach not biblical, we are actually doing the devil's work for him. That's right. And when I saw this, I was furious, and I was determined to get this message out to the global church, because we have to stop. We have to draw a line in the sand and stop partnering with the enemy, which is what we've been doing. So after this program today, hopefully you will see clearly, and you will be determined never to parent that way again. All right, so I'm going to walk you through the revelation, the foundational revelation that opened the door for me to a whole new way of parenting. And I began seeing that there actually is a blueprint in the scriptures, all the way through the scriptures, of how we're supposed to be parenting. And when I first came to the scriptures, I didn't think there was much there about parenting. And the Lord showed me that the entire Bible is a parenting book, because it's the story of God and how he relates to his children. And so if we can step back and see the big picture, you begin seeing these patterns that are actually keys. They're kingdom keys for how we are to parent our children. And let me tell you something, God's ways are perfect. And he doesn't end up with statistics of 2 out of 3 losses. That's not God's way. And there's even an argument that the one that stays in the church is even misguided because of the way we've been parenting. So I'm going to walk you through the revelations so that you can have the same revelation, hopefully, and you'll be able to see clearly that this is not, the way we've been parenting is not the way God intended. And that's why it's so stressful and why it doesn't work. So when I began studying the scriptures, the only thing I knew, and I was coming at it from this premise, was that there's no punishment left for sin. Under the new covenant, there's no punishment left for sin. So why are we punishing our kids? And so as I began to study, though, the Lord very quickly took me back to Genesis and the 2 trees in the middle of the garden. Now I thought, what in the world am I going to learn about parenting there? Well, since then, I've learned that Genesis, being the beginning of everything, you can sort out just about any doctrinal question you have if you go back to the beginning, because that's where everything went awry. And I think that's why we get a lot of conflict in our doctrinal beliefs, is because we don't go back to the beginning, and so we get off track. But that's another topic. So as I went back to Genesis and I'm reading along, obediently, I said, "Okay, Lord, I'll read through Genesis. I've read it several times, but you want me to read it again? I will read it again." So I'm reading along. I didn't have to get very far. I got to Genesis chapter 2, verse 17, which says, "And of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day you eat of it, you will die." Now, I had read that verse many times, and I'd read the name of that tree many times, and it never made any sense to me. And a couple of times in my life, I had stopped and just thought about the name of that tree. What does that mean? And I never got any revelation on it until now. And this time, as I read it in the context of parenting, I'm telling you, it lit up like a billboard, like a neon billboard, and it stopped me in my tracks. And I thought to myself, wait a minute, the knowledge of good and evil, that's what brought the downfall of the entire human race. Then why are we teaching our kids right and wrong or good and evil and expecting it to work? When God said, in the day you eat of that fruit, you will die. I mean, I stood there stunned. I thought, why is no one talking about this? And that's why I said, what you hear on this program, I don't know anyone else who's talking about this in regards to parenting. And when I made this discovery, I'd never heard anyone talk about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And now there are a lot of people talking about it. But as far as I know, I'm the only one talking about it in regards to parenting. And this is a huge area. I mean, parenting is everything. We are creating the future in the way that we raise our children. So it's super important that we understand how God has designed for us to parent. So I read this and I thought, oh my goodness, why are we continuing in this, behavior-focused parenting? We talked last episode about how, traditional Christian parenting looks at behavior, and we're relating to our children through their behavior. And, it teaches them that their value and worth is in their ability to be good and do what's right. Excuse me. But and then they also learn that God accepts them or rejects them based on their behavior. And we know that isn't true. God judges us based on our heart, not on our behavior. So when we train our children in this behavior-focused living, it's training them up in religion, which is trying to be good to please God and gain favor with Him. So we've been deceived, just as Adam and Eve were deceived. And we've believed that teaching our kids right and wrong is what we're supposed to do. I mean, what parent doesn't believe that? I did until I learned this. I thought, it sounds like a good thing, just like it sounded good to Eve. Oh yeah, to know good and evil sounds like a good idea, to be like God. And so we've all fallen into this trap. And that's why I say, we're doing the devil's work for him. We're continuing to feed our children this poison fruit of death. And he's off on a vacation, sitting on the beach, drinking little drinks with umbrellas in them with his feet up, while we're force feeding our children the poison fruit of death. I don't know about you, but that kind of gets my goat. That makes me that makes me pretty angry that we've been this deceived. And I'm determined to get this message out to as many Christians as I can in my lifetime. So as I read this verse, something stood out to me besides the knowledge of good and evil, and realizing that that's what we've been teaching our children, and we're feeding them this fruit of death. But another phrase in that passage stood out to me, and that was this. God said, in the day you eat of it, you will die. And I don't think God uses words carelessly. And so I thought about that. I thought, prior to this, I just thought that death entered their bodies and eventually they died physically. But that isn't in the day. And as I pondered this just for a moment, immediately what came to my mind was John chapter 3. When Jesus says that unless you are born again, you cannot see the kingdom of God. Let me read it to you from the NIV. Very, very truly, I tell you, no one can see the kingdom of God unless you are born again. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. To be born again means that something was born before, and then it died, and then it has to be born again. And Jesus goes on in that verse to explain that he's talking about a spiritual rebirth. And that's when it hit me. What died that day in the garden were Adam and Eve's spirits. They experienced spiritual death. And that's why Jesus said you have to be born again of the Spirit. So what's born of flesh is flesh. What's born of spirit. And so, you think about it, we know that when Adam and Eve experienced the result of that fruit, that their perception, the way they perceived everything around them, dramatically changed. Or you could say the way they saw everything dramatically changed, because their spirits died, so their spiritual eyes closed. And now what are they left with? Only the eyes of their flesh. So they're perceiving everything through their flesh. And this is why they looked at themselves and they said, we're naked, and they were ashamed. When only a few short verses before that, it said they were naked and unashamed. Well, what changed? The only thing that changed was the way they saw themselves. So I think prior to the fall, Adam and Eve were spirit beings with a body. I believe that their body was internal, and their spirit, they were covered in their spirit. They were glowing spirit beings with a body. And when their spirits died, then their flesh was exposed. And that's why they said, we're naked. Now, that's just my take on it. I don't know, but I just believe they were clothed in spirit, and then they lost that, and it left their flesh exposed. So they experienced a spiritual death when they ate this fruit. But something else happened simultaneously. In Genesis 3:7, it tells us, then the eyes of both of them were opened. Well, wait a minute. Spiritual eyes closed and something else was awakened. What was that? And it says, and they knew they were naked. Well, if you're not operating in the spirit, you're operating in what? The flesh. And like I said, their spirits died, and so they were just left with their flesh. Well, evidently, this knowledge of good and evil not only killed their spirits and closed their spiritual eyes, it also aroused their natural mind, their human understanding, or you could say their carnal mind, their flesh mind. And so now they're seeing everything, perceiving the world around them, themselves, God, and everything through their human or carnal mind. And we know from Romans 8 that the carnal mind is at enmity to death, or at enmity with God, and that when we're led by the flesh, it leads to death. So that's what God said. When you eat this fruit, it will lead to death, because it will close your spiritual eyes. It'll open your carnal mind, your human understanding. And now you'll be operating from the flesh. And we know that leads to death. So that kind of falls in line with what he said would happen if they ate this fruit. So I believe that my interpretation of what was aroused is accurate there, based on what we know from the New Testament. 1 Corinthians 2:14 also tells us that the natural man does not receive the things of God, that God is spirit, and the things of God are spiritually discerned. So here Adam and Eve they're no longer operating in their spirits, so they can't relate to God anymore. And this was like the Pharisees. This is why the Pharisees could not accept Jesus. They were completely in their heads. They were understanding everything about God through their human understanding of, what was written. When we operate in the flesh, we're operating through our natural senses, things that we can perceive and understand with our natural man, right? And that's what they were doing. And Jesus, they were spiritually dead. Jesus said that they were like whitewashed tombs, that inside there was dead man's bones. And so you see that this natural way of relating to God doesn't work. So let's look at the result of this knowledge of good and evil. What did Adam and Eve begin? How did it change the way they operated? Well, prior to this, they were innocent. They didn't know that good and evil existed. Everything was it just was. Everything just was. And they didn't judge things as good or bad or right or wrong. And, everything was good, right? God created the world and he said it was good. And so when this knowledge of good and evil then introduces this concept that, some things can be bad and some things can be good. And so it causes us to judge. And that's exactly what Adam and Eve did. As soon as they ate this fruit, they began to judge everything. The first thing they judged was themselves. And they judged themselves unworthy of God's presence. So they ran and hid from God. The next thing they judged was each other. When God confronted them, Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent, and Adam even blamed God and said, "You gave me this woman." And so it causes us to judge. And when we get into judging, then somebody's guilty. And so that's what happens when we parent this way. when we judge our children through their behavior, we relate to them through their behavior, we judge it as good or bad, well, they're either guilty or not. And so we are actually parenting with that mindset of good and evil. If you think about it, this is the same as the old covenant or the law. Under that covenant, they were blessed if they did good, and they were punished if they did wrong, if they broke the rules, right? And we know from the New Testament, Paul wrote extensively in Romans and in Galatians that the law also leads to death, because here you have this covenant that related to behavior, just the way we've been parenting our kids, focused on behavior, trying to address behavior, do this, don't do this, and it was all about externals. And God is not concerned about externals. In fact, we know that this covenant was only given to prove to us, to make us guilty before God, and to prove to us that we couldn't measure up to God's standards. We couldn't be acceptable to God through our behavior. That's the thing that got Adam and Eve kicked out of the garden, was that they were now operating in that knowledge of good and bad and judging whether they're worthy or not. So this whole idea of judgment came into the world because of the knowledge of good and evil. And so two things happened in the fall. First of all, as we've said, the carnal mind was aroused. And we think that Adam and Eve sinned because they ate the fruit, and that God told them not to, and they disobeyed, and that was the sin. Well, God didn't tell them not to eat that fruit as a rule that if you break it, I'll punish you. He warned them that that fruit was deadly. Just like you would warn your child, don't run out in the street, it's dangerous. Don't put your finger in the socket, it's dangerous. You're warning your child because you're trying to protect them. It's the same thing. God was saying, don't eat that fruit. He was trying to protect them from the consequences, and he told them the consequences were death. And so they ate the fruit. That wasn't the sin. Sin came in because of what the fruit produced in them, which was this knowledge of good and evil, and this operating from the flesh. So the knowledge of good and evil, or operating through that behavior-focused mentality, it causes us to operate in the flesh apart from God. So think about it. If I know what's right and what's wrong, okay, I can decide I don't need God. I don't need to know. I don't need to hear his voice. I don't need to listen to him. I'm good on my own. And that's really what Adam and Eve were thinking. Like, if I have this knowledge, I'll be like God. I won't need God. It's this independence we want, as human beings from God, thinking that we can do things without him. But as I've already said, we fell for the same lie that Eve fell for. It sounds like a good thing, but it's not a good thing to know right and wrong. I mean, how many of us, we think that if we know what to do, we'll do it, right? But from experience, how you should eat. Do you always eat right? You should exercise more, or read more, or be more disciplined, or be more patient, or whatever it is. But knowing what you should do doesn't produce the results, because we're trying to do it in our own ability, in our flesh, in the strength of our flesh, and it just doesn't work that way. We have to be driven from the inside out, not from the outside in. So if you think about it, this approach of addressing behavior has never worked since the beginning of time. It didn't work for Adam and Eve. You think about the Israelites in the desert and the law, and God told them what was right and what to do, what not to do. They couldn't do it. Nobody can do it. Jesus was the only one that could live by the law and succeed. And so behavior, this good or bad behavior, knowing it doesn't help us. It doesn't cause us to do what's right. So when we parent from the flesh, we're actually judging our children based on what we can see in their behavior, right? We're relating to them and responding, reacting to them based on what they do, on their behavior. And we're perceiving them through our natural mind, through our flesh. And I'm not trying to make anyone here feel condemnation. Like I said, I fell for the same lie. We all did, because we were all in Adam when he fell. And the world has operated from that mentality of right and wrong since then. So for 6,000 years, that mentality has been ingrained in human DNA. And we automatically default to that unless we make the effort to operate from the Spirit. So we will always operate in the flesh as human beings unless we consciously make the choice to be led by the Spirit. So I'm just pointing it out so you'll see it, not so that you'll feel condemnation, because there's no condemnation. If you have done the best you knew how with the information you had, and your heart was right, you were doing it because you were trying to, please God and walk in his ways, well, that's what God looks at. And see, that's what we're going to get into, is that God doesn't judge us based on our behavior. He judges us on the attitude or the condition of our heart. So there's mercy for our shortcomings, but God looks at the heart. So please, please, please do not condemn yourself or feel guilty. You're in the right place. You're on a good path. We're gonna get you to where you'll be able to operate in the Spirit, and it's so freeing, and it's so easy, and it's so beautiful and powerful and effective that you'll never want to go back to the old way. So let's move on here. So I want to talk about, before we run out of time, is that the second thing. So the first thing that happened was their carnal nature was aroused. The second thing that happened was they were separated from God. Now, they separated themselves from God because they felt unworthy in their natural state. And that's true, that we can't relate to God through our flesh. Scripture tells us that that God is spirit. We have to relate to him through spirit. But God put them out of the garden and physically separated them from himself. Now, this, again, we think that God did this to punish them for disobeying. And, the word disobedience is never even mentioned in the account of the fall in the scriptures. Go read it for yourself. No, God put them out of the garden to protect them. And if you read in Genesis 22 through 23, it says, behold, the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also from the tree of life and eat and live forever. And then there's just a dash. Like, God could not even finish this thought because he couldn't even bear the thought of man living forever in this fallen state. So he put him out of the garden to protect him from eating from the tree of life at that point and living forever in that fallen state. So once again, we've misinterpreted God's intentions from the beginning, that he was not punishing them, he was protecting them. Okay, so what happened then was Adam and Eve were left on their own to live in their own strength from their flesh, to provide for themselves. And when he put them out of the garden, he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, you shall not eat it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For you are dust, and to dust you shall return. So God was not saying, this is your punishment. He's saying, this is the result. I warned you not to eat from that fruit, because look this is your fate. This is your reality. You're living now in the flesh, in your own strength. You got to provide for yourself. It was just the result of eating this fruit. It wasn't what God was putting on them as punishment. So in summary, we have to ask ourselves now, so if we don't teach our children right and wrong, then what do we do as parents? And that's what we're going to get into as we go through this course. Now, I mentioned last week that for the first few lessons, we're working on our own mindset. And as you can see from this lesson, we have a lot of ideas and beliefs that we're operating from that just aren't accurate. And so we have to get rid of the old ways of thinking. And then the next few lessons, we're going to look at how we've looked at our children, and we've seen them through a lens that isn't accurate either scripturally or from a natural cognitive perspective. And we have to get all these things right before we can begin to learn a new way of parenting. Jesus said that you cannot put new wine in old wineskins. And what he was referring to was, you can't understand new ways or the new covenant ways of doing things until you get rid of your old covenant mindset. And I hope that you can see from a little bit I've shared today. I know I pack a lot in a small amount of time, but that's why I encourage you to get the book and follow through with me in it as we go through. You'll get much more out of it. And there is a workbook. If it's not available now, it'll be available soon. But you can scan the QR code on the screen, and that'll take you to my website where you can access all the resources, the book, the workbook, and a lot of other resources there. There's also the website, gracefulparenting.net. You can go to that. And then we're going to learn about how we parent from the way God intended. And just to give you a little bit of a heads up, so if the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is death, well, right there with it was the tree of life. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to learn to shift from that tree of death to the tree of life, because everything you want for your children is nestled right there in its branches. And Jesus said that he was the way, the truth, and the life. And so everything that we want for our children is in Christ, but we can learn what that is through studying these two trees. And all the way back in the beginning, God gave us an example through these two trees of the old and the new covenant, of the flesh and the spirit, and living from, that abundant life, the tree of life that Jesus came to give us. And so it's so super powerful, and it's so effective. It's going to blow your mind. So next week, we're going to take a look at these two trees. We're going to compare and contrast them and learn about their attributes. So this isn't just going to help you in your parenting. This will help you in every aspect of your life to recognize when you're operating from the flesh or when you're operating in the spirit. And so it's a powerful concept. Like I said, you can sort out any question you have if you go back far enough to these two trees in the garden, because that's where everything started and that's where everything went awry. So lastly, I just want to say, if this is the first time you've joined me, you're not too late. We just started last week on chapter 1 of the book, and you can access that program through the on-demand feature of this network. You can look that up and watch it there and catch up. And I encourage you to grab a friend to go through this study with you. It always makes it easier to have a comrade along the way. So I just want to thank you for watching today. I hope it's been helpful. And until next time, take care and God bless.